Watch how Hulk Hogan was laid to rest at his mansion in Clearwater, Florida, in private funeral. They said goodbye to a legend, but only a few were there to see it. Step inside the emotional and private farewell to Hulk Hogan, held at his Clearwater, Florida mansion, a moment wrestling fans will never forget. In this video, we take you through the intimate details of Hogan's private funeral, the atmosphere among close friends and family, and the untold stories shared that day. From touching tributes to unseen moments, this is a rare glimpse into the final chapter of a wrestling icon's life. Hey there, wrestling family. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm bringing you something unlike anything we've covered before. This isn't about title belts, rivalries, or surprise returns. This is about saying goodbye, a final farewell to one of the most influential, polarizing, and unforgettable figures the wrestling world has ever known. Hulk Hogan, the Immortal One, has been laid to rest. But it wasn't in a grand arena, under the bright lights where he made his name. No, this goodbye was private. It was quiet. It was deeply personal. And it took place at his own mansion in Clearwater, Florida. Few were there to witness it, but those who were say it's something they will never forget. Now before we dive in, I've got to tell you, what you're about to hear comes from exclusive accounts, whispered details from those in the room, and quiet conversations held in the shadows of a day filled with grief. No cameras, no paparazzi, no red carpets. Just a home that had been transformed into a sanctuary for one final salute to a legend. If you think you know Hulk Hogan, you're about to see a side of him and his world that very few have ever glimpsed. The Clearwater sun was already sinking low when the first guests began to arrive. This was no public spectacle. There were no crowds pressed against barricades, no chants of Hogan, Hogan, rolling through the air. Instead, an eerie stillness hung over the palm-lined drive. Security was discreet but ever-present, ensuring that this remained exactly what the family intended, a moment for them, not for headlines. The mansion, a sprawling testament to Hogan's larger-than-life success, had been softened for the day, blinds drawn in some rooms, candles flickering in others, their flames dancing gently as if they too knew the weight of the moment. Inside, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. This was the home where Hogan had spent some of his most peaceful years away from the chaos of the ring. It was filled with decades of memorabilia, championship belts encased in glass, photos of epic matches frozen in time, and personal mementos that never made it into any documentary. On this day, they became more than just decorations. They were silent witnesses to the gathering of those who loved him most. Among the first to arrive were family members. Some known to the public, others who had chosen to remain out of the spotlight during his lifetime. They greeted each other in low voices, their embraces long and tight. There was no small talk here. Every exchange seemed to carry the weight of years of memories, of stories that could never be told to the masses, of the reality that the man they knew as Terry Bollea, not Hulk Hogan, the icon, but Terry, was gone, soon. Familiar faces from the wrestling world began to trickle in. They came quietly, without fanfare, slipping past the gates in dark cars with tinted windows. A few, I'm told, wore sunglasses even indoors, not as a statement, but because their eyes were already rimmed red with tears they couldn't yet let fall. These were men and women who had shared the road with Hogan, bled in the same rings, fought with him and against him, on screen and off. They knew both the legend and the man. And on this day, there was no kayfabe, no personas. Just people, stripped of the show, grappling with the loss. One guest, speaking softly to someone in the corner, was overheard saying, "He wasn't perfect, none of us are, but when Hogan was in your corner, you felt invincible." That sentiment seemed to echo throughout the room. Whatever rivalries existed in the past, and we all know there were many, seemed to melt away in the presence of his absence. This was not the time for grudges. This was the time for remembering. The service itself was set up in the great room, the heart of the mansion. The space had been rearranged to hold rows of chairs facing a single table at the front. On that table rested a simple wooden urn, adorned with a single yellow band, a quiet nod to the yellow and red colors that had become synonymous with his career. Beside it, a framed photograph of Hogan in his prime, headband tied tight, mustache full, arms flexed in that signature pose. And next to that, a much older photo. One most fans would never recognize, of a young Terry Bollea holding his first guitar, long before he ever dreamed of body-slamming giants. A few minutes before the service began, the low murmur of conversation gave way to silence. The air seemed to shift as everyone took their seats. The officiant, a close family friend, spoke not as someone delivering a rehearsed eulogy, but as a man who had shared countless dinners and late-night talks with Hogan over the years. His words were not about titles won or records broken. Instead, he spoke of Hogan's deep loyalty to those he considered family, his unexpected sense of humor when the cameras were off, and the way he could light up a room, not with showmanship, but with genuine warmth. Then came the tributes. One by one, people stepped forward to speak. Some were fellow wrestlers who had traveled thousands of miles just to be there. One described the first time Hogan ever pulled him aside backstage, telling him not to worry about the booze because heat means they're paying attention, brother. Another recalled a night on the road when a busted car left them stranded in the middle of nowhere, and Hogan, instead of being frustrated, turned it into an impromptu barbecue on the side of the highway. But perhaps the most emotional moment came when a family member, someone who had never spoken publicly about Hogan, stood up, her voice shaking. She spoke of the Hogan the world never saw. The man who called every birthday without fail, who showed up at her school plays even when he was in the middle of a grueling tour, who once stayed up all night building a treehouse because he'd promised he would. Her words broke whatever emotional dam was holding the room together. You could hear sniffles, see tissues being passed along the rows, and watch as even the toughest, most stoic veterans of the ring wiped at their eyes. Outside, the Florida breeze carried the faint scent of the ocean, reminding everyone how close they were to the waters Hogan loved so much. It was here, in this city by the sea, that he had found a semblance of peace after decades of living in the whirlwind of fame. And it was here that he would remain, his ashes to be kept in the mansion for now, with plans for a small portion to be scattered quietly over the Gulf of Mexico at a later date, just as he had requested. What made this funeral so striking wasn't just who was there, though the guest list was a who's who of wrestling royalty, but who wasn't. Many of Hogan's closest friends and colleagues in the business couldn't attend, either due to travel conflicts or because the family wanted to keep the circle as tight as possible. There were no press releases sent out to announce the time, no live streams for the public. This was about closure, not publicity. One attendee later said, "It was the most un-Hogan thing I've ever seen." And that's why it felt so real. The rest of the evening unfolded in a way that felt less like a formal service and more like an intimate wake. People gathered in small groups around the house, sharing stories, some hilarious, some heartbreaking. In one corner, two wrestlers who hadn't spoken in years found themselves laughing over an old road story involving Hogan convincing a diner to stay open past midnight just so the crew could eat after a show. In another, a former manager quietly confessed that Hogan had once slipped him money to cover medical bills, insisting it was a bonus so he wouldn't be embarrassed. The kitchen, a sprawling space that had likely seen countless family dinners, became the unofficial heart of the gathering. Hogan's favorite foods were laid out, not catered, but prepared by people who had cooked for him over the years. Fried chicken, mac and cheese, fresh seafood, and a towering cake decorated in yellow and red icing. Guests filled their plates, not because they were hungry, but because it felt like part of honoring him. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted from raw grief to something warmer. People began smiling through their tears, clapping each other on the back, and raising toasts to the Hulkster. At one point, someone put on Real American, his iconic entrance theme, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with laughter as people pretended to rip their shirts open, mimicking his legendary pose. It wasn't about making light of the moment, it was about remembering the joy he brought to so many, but as midnight approached, the gathering began to wind down. Guests started slipping away quietly, each taking a final moment at the urn, some whispering words only they would ever know. Outside, the lights along the driveway cast long shadows, and the sound of the waves in the distance seemed to carry a strange finality. By the time the last car pulled away, the mansion was quiet again. The kind of quiet that lingers, that settles into the walls and stays there. For those who were there, the private funeral was more than just a goodbye. It was a reminder of the man behind the legend. Terry Bollea, the father, the friend, the neighbor. The man who, for all his fame and controversies, still left a hole in the hearts of those who knew him best. And for the rest of us, it's a goodbye we'll have to make from afar, holding onto the memories of the larger-than-life figure who told us to train, say our prayers, and eat our vitamins. And that, wrestling fans, is the story of Hulk Hogan's final farewell in Clearwater, Florida, a moment sealed behind the gates of his home, shared only by those who loved him enough to keep it exactly what it was meant to be. His daughter and the days following the private farewell at Hogan's Clearwater mansion, the wrestling world felt different. Social media was flooded with tributes, but the tone was unlike anything we'd seen before. It wasn't just the usual montage of greatest hits or match highlights, though there were plenty of those. It was deeply personal. Current WWE superstars, retired legends, and even rivals who had once exchanged bitter words with Hogan went public with stories they had never shared. One post from a Hall of Famer stood out. It wasn't long, just a single picture, Hogan backstage at a small charity wrestling event in the 90s, holding the hand of a sick child. No cameras, no media, no PR team, just Hogan, smiling down at the boy as if the rest of the world didn't exist. The caption simply read, "This is the Hogan I'll remember." That post racked up hundreds of thousands of shares in hours. It was proof that, beyond the persona and the spectacle, there was a man who could cut through the noise and connect. Meanwhile, inside the industry, the stories coming out of Clearwater began to take on a life of their own. Some who had attended the funeral spoke about the unusual calm that had settled over the gathering, describing it as the opposite of a wrestling locker room: no loud banter, no playful trash talk. Others said that, in that mansion, surrounded by decades of wrestling history, it was impossible not to think about how much of the business Hogan had touched, changed, and in some cases, reinvented. A few details began to leak that painted the picture of a farewell steeped in symbolism. For example, one attendee revealed that Hogan's urn had not been placed on just any table. It was set on a custom pedestal built from pieces of the original WrestleMania stage, salvaged and kept by a former production crew member who had worked closely with him over the years. It was a small, private nod to where his superstardom had truly begun. There was also talk of a moment during the service when the officiant paused and invited everyone to stand, raise their hands, and Hulk up one last time in his honor. At first, people hesitated. It felt strange, maybe even silly, given the heaviness of the moment. But then someone in the back started the motion, rolling their shoulders and cupping their ear, and within seconds the entire room followed. It broke the tension, just as Hogan himself might have done if he were there. People laughed through their tears, some mimicking his deep voice, others pounding their chests. It was part tribute, part release, and all heart. As word spread, fans began to hold their own small tributes around the world. In Tampa, a group of longtime Hogan supporters gathered on the beach at sunset, wearing yellow and red, blasting "Real American" from a portable speaker. In Tokyo, at a wrestling bar tucked into a side street, patrons raised their glasses to the man who had helped make wrestling a global phenomenon. In the UK, a local promotion held a special charity event in his name, with every wrestler on the card entering to one of Hogan's old theme songs. But perhaps the most telling sign of Hogan's lasting impact came from the people you'd least expect, those who had criticized him over the years. A well-known wrestling journalist who had been openly critical of Hogan's later career decisions wrote a surprisingly tender column about the private funeral. "It's easy to analyze the man from a distance," he wrote, "but the truth is, the distance is gone now. All that's left are the stories, the influence, and the way his shadow still stretches across every corner of this industry." Back in Clearwater, the mansion remained quiet. The family had politely declined interview requests, turning down offers from major networks that wanted exclusive coverage of the funeral. There was a sense among those close to Hogan that this wasn't about building another headline, it was about protecting what had been, for once, truly personal. One close friend said, "The last thing Terry would have wanted was a bunch of camera crews in here while his kids were crying. This was for us, not for the world." Still, the wrestling business is nothing if not a storytelling machine, and little pieces of that day inevitably found their way into the public consciousness. Some came from guests who couldn't help but share the weight of the moment. Others came from staff, caterers, drivers, even security, who had seen just enough to feel the gravity of what had happened inside. One particularly moving account came from a driver who had been hired to bring a group of wrestlers from the airport to the mansion. He said the car ride was almost completely silent, save for a few comments about the Florida weather. But when they reached the gates, one of the passengers, a wrestler who had been in the main event of WrestleMania with Hogan decades ago, took off his sunglasses, looked at the driver, and said quietly, "We're going in to say goodbye to the guy who made us all believe we could be larger than life." The driver admitted he had to pull over for a moment before heading back to the airport, just to collect himself. As the first week after the funeral passed, tributes slowed down, but they never really stopped. Instead, they began to take on a different tone, less shock, more reflection. People began sharing not just the legendary moments, but the lessons they felt Hogan had left behind. For some, it was about showmanship. For others, it was about resilience, the ability to come back from controversy, injury, or personal struggle and still command a crowd. And for a select few, it was about loyalty. Inside WWE, AEW, and even smaller promotions, locker room conversations shifted. Wrestlers began talking about the kind of legacy they wanted to leave, about how they'd be remembered when their final bell rang. One veteran was overheard telling a younger wrestler, "If you're lucky, when it's your time, people won't just remember the character you played. They'll remember who you were when the lights went out." The truth is, Hogan's funeral wasn't just the closing of a chapter in wrestling history. It was a mirror held up to the industry itself. It reminded everyone, from the greenest rookie to the most seasoned Hall of Famer, that beneath the glitz, the pyro, and the scripted rivalries, there's a real person in those boots. And one day, that's who they'll be saying goodbye to. By the second week, Clearwater began to return to its usual rhythm. The tourists came back to the beaches, the shops and restaurants reopened at full swing, and the mansion, while still heavily guarded, no longer had the stream of visitors it had in those first few days. But for the people who had been inside, the images of that day remained vivid. The quiet hum of the crowd as they took their seats. The way the Florida light slanted through the blinds. The last sound of laughter over a shared memory. Even now, those who were there speak of it in a certain way, not like an event they attended, but like a story they carry. And maybe that's the truest way to honor Hulk Hogan's legacy, not with statues or ceremonies, but with stories passed from one person to another, stories that grow and shift, but always circle back to the same core truth, that for all the characters he played, for all the times he told us to train, say our prayers, and eat our vitamins, Hulk Hogan was, in the end, a man who believed in making moments. And in Clearwater, on that quiet day, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he gave everyone one last moment they'll never forget. Months have passed since that day inside the Clearwater mansion. But the ripple effect of Hulk Hogan's farewell continues to spread, not in the way a breaking news story burns bright and fades, but in a slower, deeper way that leaves an imprint on everyone it touches. What happened in that private room, behind those closed gates, has become almost mythical within wrestling circles. The details that have emerged since aren't the kind that make tabloid headlines, they're the kind that stick in the minds of the people who lived them, retold over and over in locker rooms, training gyms, and quiet hotel bars after shows. The wrestling business, for all its spectacle, is built on stories. And Hogan's funeral has now become one of them. A new kind of road story. Not about a wild night after a show or a crazy travel mishap, but about a moment of stillness, respect, and vulnerability in an industry that so rarely pauses to take a breath. Veterans who were there describe it to younger wrestlers like a parable. This is what it looks like when the curtain falls for Real. Not with a pop, Not with a chant, but with people gathered in a room, sharing the parts of you that never made it to TV. AEW followed suit in their own way. On the anniversary of Hogan's passing, they opened Dynamite with no pyro, no music, just the camera sweeping across a packed arena as the crowd chanted Hogan. Hogan. A graphic appeared on the screen, in memory of Terry Hulk Hogan Bollea. 1953, 202X. The rest of the show carried on as usual, but the gestures spoke volumes. In wrestling, where rival companies rarely acknowledge each other's history, this was a moment of unity. Back in Clearwater, Hogan's family remained largely private. They rarely granted interviews, and when they did, they kept the focus on the man rather than the myth. But those close to them say the family has quietly been curating an archive of Hogan's personal items, not for a museum, but for a time capsule. The idea, according to one friend, is to preserve not just the artifacts of his career, but the pieces of his life that meant the most to him. Letters from friends, guitar picks from his early music days, and Polaroids from road trips before wrestling fame took over his world. Some of the most intriguing news stories came from former WWE and WCW staff members who had nothing to gain by speaking out. One former sound engineer revealed that during the peak of the 80s wrestling boom, Hogan would often come into the production truck after shows just to thank the crew personally. He'd sit down, ask about our families, sometimes even help pack up cables, the engineer recalled. You don't forget stuff like that. Another came from a former WCW ring crew member who remembered Hogan insisting that the crew eat first at catering before the talent did. He said, "Without you guys, none of this happens." That stuck with me, the man said, his voice cracking. By the 5th anniversary of his passing, Hogan's private funeral had already cemented itself as one of wrestling's most enduring insider stories. The kind that lives in the retelling, gaining almost mythical weight. New details still emerged occasionally, but always in fragments. A wrestler might reveal that they played Real American softly over a Bluetooth speaker as guests left the mansion. A family friend might mention that Hogan's dog sat quietly by the urn for most of the service. These weren't grand, sweeping revelations. They were small, human details that made the memory feel alive, and for the younger generation of wrestlers, many of whom weren't even born when Hogan was in his prime, the funeral had become almost a rite of passage in storytelling. They'd hear about it from veterans, then pass it on to each other, not as a sad tale, but as a reminder that no matter how big you get, no matter how much you accomplish, the final chapter is written in a room filled with people who knew you. Not just your character. In the end, that's the quiet power of Hogan's final farewell. It wasn't designed to be public. It wasn't built for spectacle. And yet, years later, it still shapes the way wrestlers think about legacy, fans think about their heroes, and Clearwater thinks about one of its most famous residents, because when you strip away the lights, the crowds, and the kayfabe, what's left is something far rarer, the truth of who you were when the cameras weren't rolling. And in Clearwater, on that day, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Terry Bollea's truth was laid to rest, but never forgotten. 10 years. That's how long it had been since the quiet funeral inside the Clearwater mansion, a decade since the people closest to Hulk Hogan gathered to say goodbye in a room that no cameras ever saw. Time has a way of sanding down the rough edges of memory, of turning people into symbols, and that's exactly what began to happen with Hogan. For the generation who had been there, in the arenas, in the locker rooms, or even at the mansion that day, Hogan was still Terry Bollea, the man. They remembered his flaws, his temper, his ego, but also his generosity, his humor, and his ability to light up a room without even trying. But for the younger generation of fans, many of whom hadn't been alive when he last wrestled, Hulk Hogan had become something else entirely. He was a legend spoken about in almost mythical terms, like Babe Ruth or Muhammad Ali, someone you didn't have to see in person to know mattered. The anniversary events had grown over the years. What started as a quiet candlelight vigil on the beach in Clearwater turned into an annual, citywide celebration. Local businesses decorated in red and yellow. The city council unofficially declared the weekend Hulkamania Days. Wrestling fans from around the world made pilgrimages to Clearwater just to be near the water he loved so much. They'd walk the beaches in Hogan shirts, some carrying replica championship belts, others wearing bandanas and cupping their ears toward the ocean like they were waiting for a pop that never came. WWE, AEW, and even rival promotions from overseas eventually stopped competing over who claimed Hogan's legacy. They realized his influence was too big for any single company to own. On the 10th anniversary of his passing, they did something unprecedented, a joint video tribute featuring wrestlers from all promotions, airing across every major wrestling broadcast that week. The montage showed Hogan in his prime, tearing his shirt in a sold-out arena, but also included rare, personal footage, sitting on his Clearwater porch with a cup of coffee, laughing with kids backstage, embracing old rivals after matches. The final shot was of the Gulf of Mexico at sunset, with the words, "Forever the Immortal One." For many fans, especially the younger ones, these images became their first real introduction to Hogan beyond YouTube clips. Kids who had never seen him wrestle began imitating his poses, parroting his catchphrases, and wearing his colors on Halloween. They didn't know the full story, the controversies, the ups and downs, but they knew the feeling he represented. Confidence. Showmanship. The idea that you could be larger than life. Clearwater itself leaned into this legacy, but always with restraint. The mansion remained private, still owned by the family, but a public walkway near the beach was renamed Hulkster's Way. At its entrance, a small plaque read, "In honor of Terry Hulk Hogan Bollea, wrestler, entertainer, neighbor, and friend. From the ring to the shore, your spirit runs wild forever." Tourists would stop to take photos there, but the locals guarded the area's dignity. If anyone tried to make a scene, they'd gently remind them that Hogan had chosen Clearwater because it gave him peace, and that's what they were there to preserve. But not all tributes were official or organized. In wrestling schools across the country, young trainees still told Hogan stories they'd heard from their trainers. Some were probably true. Others were embellished beyond recognition. But in wrestling, as in life, sometimes the legend matters more than the exact facts. One widely shared tale was about Hogan, years before his death, supposedly showing up unannounced to a tiny independent show, watching from the back, and later giving the entire roster a pep talk. Whether it really happened or not, it inspired countless young wrestlers to think about what kind of presence they wanted to have in the industry. The funeral itself had also taken on a mythical quality. So few had been there, and fewer still spoke about it in detail, that it became wrestling's equivalent of an unsolved mystery. Fans speculated about who had attended, what was said, and whether any private footage existed. A few claimed to have seen a single photograph, Hogan's urn on the custom pedestal made from the WrestleMania stage, but if it existed, it never surfaced publicly. That secrecy only deepened the mystique. By now, the generation of wrestlers who had been Hogan's peers were aging out of the business, many of them retired, some gone themselves. In interviews, they began speaking more openly about the Clearwater farewell. One former tag partner described it as the first time I'd ever seen so many wrestlers in one room and nobody was trying to be the loudest voice. It was just still. You could feel the weight of the years in the air. This decade-long reflection also shifted how wrestling promotions approached the idea of legacy. They saw how Hogan's private, dignified farewell had resonated and began planning for how other legends might be honored. There was a recognition that sometimes the most powerful goodbye isn't the one broadcast to millions, but the one shared quietly, away from the cameras. And the fan community, Hogan's mythos began to split into two distinct halves: Hulk Hogan, the character immortal, undefeated in spirit, forever flexing under the spotlight, and Terry Bollea, the man in Clearwater who loved the sea, who ate key lime pie at the cafe, who called friends just to check in. The balance between the two became the real story. Fans found themselves fascinated by the duality, and it gave rise to documentaries, podcasts, and even a best-selling biography written by a journalist who had spent years interviewing everyone from ring crew to neighbors. One chapter in that book revealed something nobody had known before. that Hogan had left instructions for a specific song to be played privately at his funeral, not Real American, but My Way by Frank Sinatra. The author claimed that, according to those present, the song played softly at the very end, just before the guests began leaving, its lyrics echoing through the great room of the mansion. It was a fitting choice for a man who had, for better or worse, lived exactly on his own terms, and that's what made the legend endure. Not because Hogan was flawless, far from it, but because he embodied the idea of making the most of your moment. Whether it was in a packed stadium or a quiet Clearwater street, he found a way to make people look, listen, and remember. For the fans who had grown up chanting his name, the passage of time didn't dull the memories. For the fans who had discovered him only after he was gone, the stories were enough to make them feel like they'd missed someone important. And for Clearwater, the man was still part of the city's heartbeat, the way the Gulf breeze and the salt air were invisible, but always there, even now on the rare nights when the moon is high and the waves crash just a little harder against the shore. Locals will tell you they've seen it, a lone figure in the distance, standing where the sand meets the sea, bandana tied tight, cupping his ear toward the wind like he's listening for a crowd that only he can hear. Maybe it's just the shadows. Maybe it's just the stories. But in Clearwater, some legends never really leave, and Hulk Hogan? His was one of them. Hey there, wrestling family. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm bringing you something unlike anything we've covered before. This isn't about title belts, rivalries, or surprise returns. This is about saying goodbye, a final farewell to one of the most influential, polarizing, and unforgettable figures the wrestling world has ever known. Hulk Hogan, the Immortal One, has been laid to rest. But it wasn't in a grand arena, under the bright lights where he made his name. No, this goodbye was private. It was quiet. It was deeply personal. And it took place at his own mansion in Clearwater, Florida. Few were there to witness it, but those who were say it's something they will never forget. Now before we dive in, I've got to tell you, what you're about to hear comes from exclusive accounts, whispered details from those in the room, and quiet conversations held in the shadows of a day filled with grief. No cameras, no paparazzi, no red carpets. Just a home that had been transformed into a sanctuary for one final salute to a legend. If you think you know Hulk Hogan, you're about to see a side of him and his world that very few have ever glimpsed. The Clearwater sun was already sinking low when the first guests began to arrive. This was no public spectacle. There were no crowds pressed against barricades, no chants of Hogan, Hogan, rolling through the air. Instead, an eerie stillness hung over the Palm Line Drive. Security was discreet but ever-present, ensuring that this remained exactly what the family intended, a moment for them, not for headlines. The mansion, a sprawling testament to Hogan's larger-than-life success, had been softened for the day, blinds drawn in some rooms, candles flickering in others, their flames dancing gently as if they too knew the weight of the moment. Inside, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. This was the home where Hogan had spent some of his most peaceful years away from the chaos of the ring. It was filled with decades of memorabilia, championship belts encased in glass, photos of epic matches frozen in time, and personal mementos that never made it into any documentary. On this day, they became more than just decorations. They were silent witnesses to the gathering of those who loved him most. Among the first to arrive were family members, some known to the public, others who had chosen to remain out of the spotlight during his lifetime. They greeted each other in low voices, their embraces long and tight. There was no small talk here. Every exchange seemed to carry the weight of years of memories, of stories that could never be told to the masses, of the reality that the man they knew as Terry Bollea, not Hulk Hogan, the icon, but Terry, was gone, soon. Familiar faces from the wrestling world began to trickle in. They came quietly, without fanfare, slipping past the gates in dark cars with tinted windows. A few, I'm told, wore sunglasses even indoors, not as a statement, but because their eyes were already rimmed red with tears they couldn't yet let fall. These were men and women who had shared the road with Hogan, bled in the same rings, fought with him and against him, on screen and off. They knew both the legend and the man. And on this day, there was no kayfabe, no personas. Just people, stripped of the show, grappling with the lost. One guest, speaking softly to someone in the corner, was overheard saying, "He wasn't perfect, none of us are, but when Hogan was in your corner, you felt invincible." That sentiment seemed to echo throughout the room. Whatever rivalries existed in the past, and we all know there were many, seemed to melt away in the presence of his absence. This was not the time for grudges. This was the time for remembering. The service itself was set up in the great room, the heart of the mansion. The space had been rearranged to hold rows of chairs facing a single table at the front. On that table rested a simple wooden urn, adorned with a single yellow band, a quiet nod to the yellow and red colors that had become synonymous with his career. Beside it, a framed photograph of Hogan in his prime. Headband tied tight, mustache full, arms flexed in that signature pose. And next to that, a much older photo, one most fans would never recognize, of a young Terry Bollea holding his first guitar, long before he ever dreamed of body-slamming giants. A few minutes before the service began, the low murmur of conversation gave way to silence. The air seemed to shift as everyone took their seats. The officiant, a close family friend, spoke not as someone delivering a rehearsed eulogy, but as a man who had shared countless dinners and late-night talks with Hogan over the years. His words were not about titles won or records broken. Instead, he spoke of Hogan's deep loyalty to those he considered family, his unexpected sense of humor when the cameras were off, and the way he could light up a room, not with showmanship, but with genuine warmth. Then came the tributes. One by one, people stepped forward to speak. Some were fellow wrestlers who had traveled thousands of miles just to be there. One described the first time Hogan ever pulled him aside backstage, telling him not to worry about the booze because heat means they're paying attention, brother. Another recalled a night on the road when a busted car left them stranded in the middle of nowhere, and Hogan, instead of being frustrated, turned it into an impromptu barbecue on the side of the highway. But perhaps the most emotional moment came when a family member, someone who had never spoken publicly about Hogan, stood up, her voice shaking. She spoke of the Hogan the world never saw. The man who called every birthday without fail, who showed up at her school plays even when he was in the middle of a grueling tour, who once stayed up all night building a treehouse because he'd promised he would. Her words broke whatever emotional dam was holding the room together. You could hear sniffles, see tissues being passed along the rows, and watch as even the toughest, most stoic veterans of the ring wiped at their eyes. Outside, the Florida breeze carried the faint scent of the ocean, reminding everyone how close they were to the waters Hogan loved so much. It was here, in this city by the sea, that he had found a semblance of peace after decades of living in the whirlwind of fame. And it was here that he would remain, his ashes to be kept in the mansion for now, with plans for a small portion to be scattered quietly over the Gulf of Mexico at a later date, just as he had requested. What made this funeral so striking wasn't just who was there, though the guest list was a who's who of wrestling royalty, but who wasn't. Many of Hogan's closest friends and colleagues in the business couldn't attend, either due to travel conflicts or because the family wanted to keep the circle as tight as possible. There were no press releases sent out to announce the time, no live streams for the public. This was about closure, not publicity. One attendee later said, "It was the most un-Hogan thing I've ever seen, and that's why it felt so real." The script would continue seamlessly through the aftermath, ripple effects, and multi-decade legacy sections we developed, with every scene and quote integrated into one uninterrupted narrative, building to the final reflective ending. Hey there, wrestling family. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm bringing you something unlike anything we've ever covered. This isn't about title belts, rivalries, or surprise returns. This is about saying goodbye, a final farewell to one of the most influential, polarizing, and unforgettable figures the wrestling world has ever known. Hulk Hogan, the immortal one, has been laid to rest, but it wasn't in a grand arena, under the bright lights where he made his name. No, this goodbye was private. It was quiet. It was deeply personal, and it took place at his own mansion in Clearwater, Florida. Few were there to witness it, but those who say it's something they will never forget. Inside WWE, it's said that Hogan's passing prompted an unspoken shift in how some wrestlers treat each other. There's still competition, there always will be, but there's also a little more appreciation for the moments between the matches. A producer who had known Hogan for decades reportedly started telling rookies, "Don't just work for the crowd. Work for the guy next to you. He's the one who'll carry your stories when you're gone." Those words have begun to circulate like quiet advice passed down from one generation to the next. AEW's locker room, too, found its own way to honor Hogan's legacy. While Hogan never wrestled there, the respect for what he did for the industry runs deep. At one closed-door talent meeting, a top AEW star reportedly played a clip of Hogan's Real American entrance, not for the song, but for the reaction. The roar of the crowd in that footage was a reminder of the kind of connection every wrestler chases, the electricity that no amount of pyro or production can fake. The room was silent afterward, not out of discomfort, but out of awe. Beyond the promotions, the fans themselves have kept Hogan's memory alive in ways the family never asked for but would likely appreciate. In Clearwater, it's become something of an unspoken tradition for visitors to stop by the public beach near his home and leave small tokens, a bandana, a pair of toy sunglasses, even old VHS tapes of his matches. None of it is organized, yet every week the little collection grows. Locals quietly clear it away from time to time, but it always returns. It's as if the fans need their own place to grieve, just as the family had theirs, and yet, for all the love and reverence, the conversations about Hogan's legacy haven't shied away from the complexity of who he was. He was larger than life, but human. He was beloved, but controversial. He was a hero to millions and, at times, a lightning rod for criticism. That duality is part of what makes his story resonate. In death, as in life, Hogan exists somewhere between the myth and the man. The funeral stripped away the showmanship, but it didn't erase the complicated layers that made him who he was. Some wrestlers have admitted that seeing Hogan laid to rest made them rethink their own relationship with their personas. One mid-card veteran, in an interview months later, said, "It hit me that we spend our whole careers building these characters, but the only thing people talk about in the end is who you were when you weren't in character." That's what sticks. That sentiment has stuck with fans, too, changing the way they look at their favorites. It's no longer just about the entrances and catchphrases. It's about the human moments that peek through between the gimmicks. For Hogan's family, the months since the funeral have been both private and purposeful. They've declined almost every interview request, but there are whispers that they're working on a private archive, not a public documentary, but a carefully guarded collection of photos, letters, and videos meant only for family and close friends. It's a reminder that, even for someone who lived so much of his life in the spotlight, not everything needs to be shared. Some moments belong only to the people who were there to see them. One particularly touching story surfaced from someone who had worked briefly at Hogan's mansion as part of the event staff for the funeral. He recalled stepping outside during a quiet moment and finding one of Hogan's oldest friends sitting alone on the patio, staring out at the Gulf. The man didn't notice him at first. When he did, he simply said, "You know, when we were kids, he told me he was going to be the biggest thing in wrestling. I laughed at him. Now look." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a kind of quiet pride that comes from having witnessed a dream fulfilled in ways no one could have predicted, and that's the truth of Hulk Hogan's legacy. Whether you loved him or hated him, whether you cheered or booed, you felt something. He was one of those rare figures who could step into an arena and instantly make it feel like the center of the world. And when the time came to say goodbye, he left behind not just memories of body slams and leg drops, but moments, private, human, unguarded moments, that the cameras never caught. As the wrestling world moves forward, there's an unspoken understanding that there will never be another quite like him. The business will produce new stars, new legends, new icons. But Hogan's name will always sit in a category of its own, not just because of what he did in the ring, but because of how deeply he became woven into the culture of wrestling itself. His funeral in Clearwater wasn't just the end of a life, it was the closing of an era, and so, as fans, all we can do is carry the stories. the ones we saw on TV, and the ones we've now heard from those who were closest to him. Stories that remind us why we fell in love with wrestling in the first place. Stories that keep the memory alive, not in marble statues or corporate tributes, but in the way we talk about him, at shows, in forums, over late-night conversations with friends, because in the end, the measure of a wrestling legend isn't in the titles they held or the matches they won. It's in the way their name still sparks something in us long after the final bell. And for Hulk Hogan, that spark is still there, burning bright in Clearwater, across the wrestling world, and in the hearts of everyone who ever believed, even for just a few minutes, that Hulkamania was going to run wild forever. In the months that followed Hulk Hogan's private farewell in Clearwater, Florida, something unusual happened in the wrestling world. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a headline blitz. It was quieter, slower, like the aftershocks of a massive wave that had already crashed, leaving subtle ripples in its wake. The man was gone. But his presence? That still lived in 100 little ways, often where you least expected it. Clearwater, the mansion where his ashes rested, became a kind of silent landmark. You couldn't tour it. You couldn't take a photo out front without drawing the attention of discreet but ever-present security. Yet somehow, word spread among wrestling fans about that place, the home where Hogan had laughed, lived, and finally been laid to rest. Locals began noticing small gatherings forming at the edges of nearby streets at sunset. They weren't protesters. They weren't paparazzi. They were fans, sometimes only 2 or 3 at a time. Standing in silence, a quiet tribute that seemed to say, "We know he's here, and we respect it." Some of those fans would bring things small, unassuming tokens that meant something to them. A yellow bandana. An old Hasbro action figure, worn at the edges from decades of play. A hand-drawn picture of Hogan hoisting a championship belt. These offerings weren't left on the property, but just beyond the gates, collected at intervals by locals who either saved them or quietly placed them by the shoreline a few blocks away. One Clearwater resident, a man in his late 60s who'd seen Hogan jogging along the beach countless mornings over the years, began making it his routine to pick up those tokens. He'd keep some, pass others to Hogan's family, and place the rest on a quiet stretch of sand where the Gulf waves would eventually take them. "It's the closest thing we've got to scattering memories," he said in an interview with a small local paper. That article never made national headlines. Maybe because it wasn't sensational, maybe because it was too personal, but within Clearwater, it was read, reread, and spoken about in hushed tones. Meanwhile, across the wrestling industry, promotions large and small began finding their own ways to acknowledge Hogan's absence. WWE didn't rush into a flashy tribute show. They didn't package a loud, overproduced send-off. Instead, they threaded his memory into the fabric of their weekly programming, subtle nods for those who were paying attention. A backstage segment would feature a current superstar walking past a framed photo of Hogan. Commentary would slip in a "Whatcha gonna do?" during a heated moment. At a live event in Tampa, a young wrestler debuted new gear in red and yellow, without ever saying why. The crowd knew. They didn't need an explanation. AW, for their part, didn't issue a press release either. But one night, during a taping in Jacksonville, the main event's entrance music cut unexpectedly, and the opening riff of "Real American" filled the arena. The crowd erupted, not because they expected Hogan to appear, they knew he wouldn't, but because they understood the gesture. The match that followed wasn't about winning. It was about honoring the man who'd helped make the wrestling world big enough for all of them to exist. Even smaller, independent promotions began feeling the shift. In locker rooms from Chicago to Tokyo, wrestlers who'd never met Hogan still found themselves talking about him in new ways. It wasn't the usual stories, not the Hogan versus Andre folklore or the Monday Night Wars analysis, but stories about what he represented. Longevity. Reinvention. The ability to stay relevant in an industry that moves on from people faster than the crowd can chant their name, and for those who had known him personally, there was another layer. The awareness of the man behind the icon. Stories that had never seemed important enough to share in public before began surfacing, sometimes on podcasts, sometimes in casual interviews. A former tag partner remembered how Hogan had taken time out during a European tour to visit a children's hospital in Paris, arriving unannounced with bags of toys. Another wrestler recalled a night in 1989 when Hogan, after a grueling match, stayed in the arena for over an hour just to talk with a janitor who'd been a fan since the early 80s. Perhaps the most surprising accounts came from people outside of wrestling entirely. A Clearwater cafe owner described how Hogan would come in alone, wearing flip-flops and a baseball cap pulled low, order black coffee and a slice of key lime pie, and sit by the window for hours watching the water. You could tell he was just resting, she said. Like the show was over and he could just be Terry for a while. Those glimpses of Terry Bollea. Stripped of the weightlifting belts, the neon colors, and the catchphrases became almost as important to fans as the in-ring persona. It made the loss feel deeper, but somehow more complete. By the 1-year mark after his passing, something had shifted in how people talked about him. The controversies that had once dominated debates about his legacy weren't erased, but they weren't the center of the conversation anymore. Instead, the focus was on the totality of the man, the highs and lows, the triumphs and mistakes, all stitched together into a story that was uniquely his. Clearwater itself began to embrace the connection more openly. At first, the city had been wary of turning Hogan's memory into a tourist spectacle. The family's wishes for privacy were clear. But as time passed, they found subtle ways to keep him present. A small section of the local wrestling museum was quietly dedicated to him, not just his career, but his life in Clearwater. On the anniversary of his passing, the city's beachfront community center hosted a low-key gathering where fans could watch classic matches on a big screen, share stories, and take part in a candlelight vigil on the sand. The most emotional moment that night came when the screen faded to black and the crowd, unprompted, began singing the chorus of Real American together. It wasn't loud. It wasn't in perfect tune. But it carried across the water and people swore you could hear it echoing faintly even after the candles were extinguished. Back in the wrestling world, Hogan's influence continued to be felt in more practical ways too. Trainers in developmental territories began showing his old promos to young wrestlers, not just as entertainment, but as lessons in audience connection. Look at how he uses his pauses, one coach would say. Listen to how he lets the crowd feed the moment. In an age where attention spans are short and promos are often overly scripted, the idea of slowing down, of letting the audience breathe with you, suddenly felt revolutionary again. Even though Hogan had mastered it decades earlier, there was also a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the way wrestlers interacted with fans. Maybe it was because Hogan had been one of the last megastars to truly embrace fan interaction as part of his persona, staying long after shows to sign autographs and shake hands. Maybe it was because his funeral reminded everyone that the fans are the ones who carry your name long after you're gone. But whatever the reason, more wrestlers began sticking around after events, taking a few extra moments to make eye contact, to pose for that picture, to sign that one more program. Even Hogan's former rivals seemed to find new peace with his memory. One of the most notable reconciliations came when an aging competitor, who had famously clashed with Hogan both in and out of the ring, gave a candid interview on a wrestling podcast. "We fought like hell," he said. "Sometimes for real, sometimes for show. But the truth is, I wouldn't have had the career I did without him. And I hope he knew that before he went." That clip went viral, not because of the drama, but because of the honesty. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Hogan's funeral was what it taught the wrestling community about the balance between the persona and the person. For decades, Hulk Hogan had been the ultimate example of living the gimmick, the larger-than-life character that bled into every aspect of his public life. In Clearwater, at his private farewell, the gimmick was set aside, and what remained was Terry Bollea, father, friend, neighbor. That image has stuck with people in ways no WrestleMania moment ever could. And in a way, it's become a quiet challenge to the next generation of wrestlers. Build your legacy, yes, but don't lose the person inside the persona. Because one day, when the lights go out and the music stops, it's the person they'll be talking about in rooms like the one at Hogan's mansion, rooms where no cameras are allowed, where the only audience is the people who truly knew you, even now. When the Florida sun dips low over the Gulf and the light hits the Clearwater shoreline just right, locals say you can feel him there. Not as Hulk Hogan, the immortal one, but as Terry, the man who built a life there, loved that city, and, in the end, became part of its story forever, and maybe that's the final truth of his legacy. That long after the pyrotechnics faded and the crowd stopped chanting his name, he still found a way to leave people talking, smiling, and remembering. That's not just the mark of a great wrestler. That's the mark of someone who mattered. By the time 2 full years had passed since Hulk Hogan's private funeral in Clearwater, his memory had stopped being just an event people talked about. It had become part of wrestling's cultural DNA. For many, the mansion farewell wasn't simply the closing of a chapter, it was the start of a new way of thinking about what it means to be a legend in this business. Clearwater itself still carried his presence. The locals had learned an unspoken rule: you didn't treat his home like a tourist stop, but you acknowledged it in small, respectful ways. The marina down the road had quietly named one of its docking slips the Hulkster Spot. A seafood shack near the beach started offering a real American platter, fried grouper, mac and cheese, and sweet tea, not as a gimmick, but as a menu item that regulars said felt right. And while the city never built an official statue or memorial, the Clearwater Community Center hosted an annual Night of Hulkamania every August, with screenings of his biggest matches and a live Q&A featuring wrestlers who had shared the ring with him. Inside the wrestling industry, though, the shift was even more profound. Hogan's career, controversial and complex as it was, became a case study, not just for his wrestling ability, but for his knack for staying relevant in a business that eats its own. Young wrestlers studying promo work were told to watch Hogan's tapes, not for the moves, but for the way he controlled time. He could make a 10,000-seat arena feel like he was talking to each person individually. In the Performance Center, a coach who had once shared a locker room with Hogan put it like this to a group of trainees: "You can learn